Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So today we're going over a bit of news. We're talking current events as we sometimes do.
Taking stock, checking in.
Yeah. There's rather a lot to mention and to dig into. So it'll just be a grab bag of topics. But I thought, up top we should mention, as we forgot to do last time, the victory once again of our boy Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, the reformed district attorney who easily cruised to another primary victory, which means he almost certainly will win the general election. And once again, as before, that's, on the back of just like gigantic, like Assad margins out in the blackest and poorest parts of Philly for the most part. Though he racked up lots of votes all over the place. But, it just makes for an interesting little data point, given the massive bipartisan backlash against police reform, given the fact, that Philly had a very serious crime spike. The murder rate doubled in a couple of years from 2020 to 2022-ish. But then it fell in 2023 and again in 2024, and it's now back to where it was in 2014. I'm not really sure that Krasner per se had much to do with that. I think that was largely a pandemic thing, the trauma of the pandemic. But nevertheless, it's not the case that the people who are most affected by that crime out in the poor black parts of Philadelphia, where the murders tend to happen, they weren't saying, oh, we need quote unquote law and order, like a just racist right-wing dickhead to come in and screw everything up. We like this guy.
We didn't just criminalize being black and poor, and we didn't just lock up all kinds of people for no reason. As many studies have shown, mass incarceration had no effect on reducing crime, and so it's just a separate form of abuse of certain populations. And so one thing he has done, whether or not he has directly influenced the crime rate, is he has over the years, I think if you add up cumulatively the number of years that were supposed to be served and then, take into account the commutations and pardons and whatnot, I think it's like hundreds of thousands of years not served that would have been served unnecessarily, right?
Yeah. Talking about people that were falsely convicted, or they got just a preposterous sentence for an assault 50 years ago or something like that, and you have a 75-year-old dude on dialysis. You're like, what are we even doing here? This isn't protecting anyone. This is wasting tons of money. And by the same token, Krasner is not a abolish the police guy, and one area where he actually is pretty hard law and order is the cops and
going after the cops,
rich people. Going after the cops when they break the law, when they beat the crap out of a Temple student who's just exercising his First Amendment rights. Joey Baloney, remember that guy? He was prosecuted.
Joey Baloney, abusive Joey Baloney. That's right.
And Elon Musk for running an unregistered lottery. Everyone was just, your classic American, just, I guess he can do it because he's a rich guy. But Krasner at least filed the lawsuit saying, you look at Pennsylvania law, it says that any type of lottery, you have to get permission from the government first. It's straightforward, black and white. And it didn't work, I don't think. But, at least he tried something.
And to be fair, I am an abolish the police guy, but I like Larry Krasner a lot. And, he's not feeding the problem of tough on crime nonsense.
Yeah, I think as far as a prosecutor goes, he's about as good as you could imagine in an American context. And there's clearly an appetite for someone who, he takes murders very seriously, but also white collar criminals and rich people. And he's focused on evidence-based solutions for, real low hanging fruit, like letting the ancient, elderly men with dialysis out.
And for that, he gets routinely attacked and pressured and, makes a lot of enemies with the cops and the cops unions. And it's just, he can use a lot of support from the people. If people want to support something that's a clear-cut person who's serving justice against enemies, he's somebody to look out for, whether you're a journalist or just a citizen, what have you. So well done, Larry.
Yeah, good job.
There's a great documentary on him, by the way. I forget the name of it, but I think it's on Netflix.
Okay. I'll look that up and put it in the show description. So the big news for today coming out is that Elon Musk is quote unquote out of government. He's gone. He is stepping down as being a special government employee, even though the government has argued in court that Musk is not part of DOGE at all.
It's like Schrodinger's Musk.
Yeah.
It's like, instead of the cat being dead and alive at the same time, he is like in DOGE and not in DOGE at the same time.
Yeah. And that obviously is just to avoid legal accountability for anything.
It depends on who the observer is, whether he's in it or not.
Yeah. Just don't open the box. And yeah, I mean, I guess we could briefly sort of go over what DOGE has done. It would take an entire episode, probably a series of episodes, to actually dig into all of the damage they've inflicted on the American civil service, basically. Basically a full-scale attack on all the parts of the government that just sort of operate in the background and provide vital services that everyone takes for granted and don't understand how they work. Stuff like the National Weather Service, this just giant collection of data gathering instruments that are all over the world and provide data for free that anybody can use. And a lot of private companies use to monetize. They take that data and then they sell it. They basically put a wrapper around it. There's been, some early warning systems for like hurricanes and ice storms have gone down, because stuff isn't being maintained. Obviously, that huge of an apparatus of instruments, you need to be constantly maintaining and replacing them as they break. Basically, the scientific research in this country is being destroyed. It's very much akin to Hitler's attack on the universities in the 30s. Germany used to have the best scientific research complex in the world. The Nazis destroyed it, and it never came back. It went to the U.S., that was like Einstein, running from the Nazis. And, and particularly like there's just been a massive cut to medical research of basically any kind, cancer research, diabetes research, vaccine research. The funding pipelines have been basically seized up, because it's unconstitutional. And there have been a bunch of court orders saying you have to unfreeze this money. This is something Congress is obligated. The president can't just stop it unilaterally. But just by mucking up the process, which is quite complicated, they've managed to stop the money from flowing. And I think this really hasn't sunk in at all. But, these big research institutions, Harvard, we'll talk about Harvard later, but, Northwestern, Columbia, Princeton, it's just a total carnage there.
Do you think it's because in recent years, there's been no evidence of any ecological or medical problems? I mean, no pandemics or ecological crises to speak of?
This isn't entirely Musk. It's also RFK Jr., but they just canceled this contract to stockpile bird flu vaccine. And we're right on the edge of a pandemic, a bird flu pandemic, which people have predicted will happen for decades, busting out, going from just, from birds to various mammals like cows, mutating just like what happened with COVID into a type of virus that could spread person to person. Boom, you got a pandemic. And we had a program all set to go, and the HHS just canceled the contract. They're not going to do it. It's... there's obviously the machinations with Trump and Musk that are obviously corrupt and self-serving, both in terms of, being bitter or vengeful, or in terms of lining their own pockets. Some of this stuff is just cruel. And do you think that it's just PR? They think that being anti-science, anti-medicine, anti-climate change, is good PR. Why attack those very vital things? Or is it the way that it'll help turn the country into more of a dystopia? I mean, what's your thought on the motivation? It's so capricious, maybe there's no logic at all, but what do you think? Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's one of the most senseless things I've ever seen happen in any country. This is the core of American prosperity and global power. and just tearing it up for no reason is so crazy. But, I think there's a few convincing motivations that various people have laid out that seem plausible to me. I don't know that you could confirm it exactly unless you could like interrogate Elon and RFK. But
that could be fun.
You have, on the one hand, the whole MAGA movement just hates universities. They hate higher education. They think it's basically a lib factory. This is where
the critical race theory, gets energy.
Are there, in their view, the entire university system, every part of it is you take good red-blooded, corn-fed American conservatives, and then they become blue-haired transgender SJWs, learning about feminism and critical race theory, and it's sort of the Judeo-Bolshevism, like cultural Marxism conspiracy. And I mean, there's kind of a grain of truth to that insofar as you look at the partisan breakdown at education levels. Nowadays, college graduates vote overwhelmingly for Democrats, and people without college degrees don't. I think that is less downstream of universities and more downstream of the conservative movement becoming so insane that any educated person, tends to react with horror.
Yeah, there's the two big divisions are education and gender.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Even though the fact, that's like most universities is like business schools, they're not teaching critical race theory at Wharton, and, a second motivation is I think the techlash, as John Gans has called it, the reactionary turn among the Silicon Valley elite, the venture capitalists, Elon Musk, they fucking hate their employees now. They hate how that they have any leverage whatsoever over their companies, that they have to pay them a ton of money to get people with these highly specialized skills. That's why they're so obsessed with AI. They want to fire everyone and replace them with computer slaves. And I think they look at the scientists who run all of these institutions, and they see same type of person. This is our disgusting employees that we have to pay profits that could go to me instead. And so they don't, even though that's not even really the case, like scientists don't in general make nearly as much as software engineers in Silicon Valley, but it's very much a cultural thing, I think. And the last part of it, I suspect, is that, the Silicon Valley ideology, like the way that tech bros look at everything, which is that everyone but Silicon Valley tech bros are idiots. They don't know anything. You can understand any system in 5 minutes with a tech bro genius out there with his computer. And
even though the tech bros will happily take government money like Musk did.
Oh, of course. Yeah. No, I mean, it doesn't make any sense if you actually think about it, but it's the sort of like mindset of these people. And they're totally contemptuous of any expertise, and especially government expertise. They think the government is completely pointless. It just gets in the way of entrepreneurs, and it's all completely loaded up with waste, fraud, and abuse. And so you can just cut all this shit and just get rid of it, and it doesn't matter. And I think that is kind of, you look at these.
Well, there was even actually, I'm remembering now, the Vance line. I don't know what podcast he was on. I don't know how long ago he said this. But it was this idea that, like you do in business, and like Musk, I think, has done, is you just start firing a bunch of people to find out who is quote unquote essential by seeing what happens and what goes wrong. And that's the way that if nothing goes wrong, you didn't need those people. And then if you see what goes wrong, then you can determine like, oh, I guess that was important. Oops. But of course, it depends on what you think is important and if you could even unring that bell, to mix metaphors.
Yeah, and it comes down to, these people being dumb as dog shit when it comes out to anything aside from building like an app for your phone or whatever the fuck. Like Twitter, they've fired like 80% of the staff, and to this day, somewhat to my surprise, it hasn't completely collapsed, but it is very much more buggy than it's ever been for 10 years. Its valuation
took a nosedive, right?
Yeah, well, a whole lot of those people were involved with raising money for the company. They weren't just sitting around. But you're talking about something like the Treasury payment system. That's not a damn social media app. This is stuff that is like foundational to the existence of human society, and it cannot break. And you can't just get in there and start screwing around with stuff, which is, what these guys have done in many cases.
And bureaucrats, that the thing that they know is how to administer and deal with their particular form of like government administration. Like they're professionals with respect to administering whatever that agency is in charge of. Like it's technical knowledge. So it's weird for the tech bros to not realize that technical knowledge matters, but there we are.
Yeah. And some of these guys are computer programmers, that the fact that a lot of these old government systems were built in COBOL, a language that almost nobody learns these days, that is very abstract and difficult to get your head around because it was built as sort of a business platform and a coding language at the same time. And that's, you'd think a type of expertise that these people would respect, but they don't.
I mean, that's why a lot of these people that were fired were then immediately or soon thereafter like asked to come back.
Yeah.
They're like, whoops, we actually needed those people.
They did. And, you could make the point, that like it's kind of crazy for all of these, keystone government systems to be running on a 1970s business language that's not really fit for purpose exactly. But what that would require is a lot more money. You would need to fund the bureaucracy properly so that they aren't just constantly putting out fires, and they could actually invest. It would be tens of billions of dollars to build out a robust code base in a different language. I have no idea what you would pick.
Fixing things usually has to do with building things and investing in things and understanding things, not just capriciously destroying things. Plus, it was always bullshit in the sense that even if you got rid of all federal workers, that would account for like 1% of the budget.
Yeah. Yeah, like 4%, I think.
Something like that.
And then you wouldn't, you wouldn't collect any money because that would be everyone at the IRS,
Right. Well, getting rid of the consumer protection agent. Like there's a number of places where they're actually getting money from like corrupt companies and bringing in revenue in various ways. Yeah.
A good example of this is how Elon's DOGE to the Loan Programs Office, which is this government bank that invests in cutting edge green technology, renewable energy companies and stuff. And it actually makes money. It actually makes a fair bit of money, into the billions of dollars over the years. And they just they did their usual thing of pushing everybody out, canceling all the loans and, just flushing it down the toilet. And this is something that Elon Musk himself benefited from back in 2010, $465 million loan for Tesla that saved it from certain bankruptcy. And he is pulling the ladder up.
The hypocrisy knows no bounds.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Musk apparently is in another spat with Trump and disappointed in the big, beautiful bill and for how much spending and how much the deficit will be increased and all that. But did you also see the gossip, the DC gossip about Musk and the Millers, Stephen Miller and his wife? Come on, it's pretty exciting.
I think I did. Maybe you could explain it to me.
Apparently, this is the word on the street. Don't take this for gospel. But apparently, Stephen Miller, who looks like a rat and is a Nazi, his wife and Musk and he were in a throuple. Apparently, this seems to be all the rage lately. We won't mention the other one that we've heard about, but
oh God.
Apparently, I'll just say it's in abundance right now. But no, more love to spread around. But apparently, with Musk leaving, Miller's wife is going with him. This is the word on the street. So apparently, he has snatched Miller's wife from Miller. The throuple has severed Stephen from the.
Yeah.
And I don't know. This is just the word on the street, but maybe. That's a different kind of Doge cut right there.
I did notice. I mean, it was reported, I believe, that Katie Miller is leaving the White House to go work for Musk directly, and in her Twitter profile, the banner image is a SpaceX rocket going up, and so
so it's a metaphor. It's she's riding the Musk rocket. Oh, boy.
Yeah, maybe Elon gave her a horse, as he's been known to do in years past. Before we move on, though, one last thing I want to mention about DOGE is probably the agency that got hit the worst was USAID. And, that obviously is, the foreign aid, a big part of U.S. foreign aid. And this is already killed tens of thousands of people. So there's PEPFAR. That's George W. Bush's anti-HIV thing to just hand out AIDS medication to people in Africa for, at cost. Basically, it's like $1 a dose or something. Saved 25 million lives. And there were 20 million people getting AIDS medication as a result. Something like the PEPFAR impact counter has an estimate of how many people have died because of this program being frozen. And it's like 58,000 adults and about 5,800 children. And it'll be into the millions, if it persists. HIV is almost universally fatal without treatment. Something like 1,500 babies are born every day HIV positive because Elon took away their mother's medication. And there's like 60,000 metric tons of food aid that's just rotting in warehouses around the world that we already paid for as taxpayers, but it can't be dispersed because the program's been shut down.
Because DOGE, which cares about reducing waste, is doing this.
Yeah.
Speaking of waste, Elon Musk exists.
Yeah. Real, rogues villain of history, like the rogues gallery of history, or like Stalin-esque, Hitler-esque crimes. We could be talking tens of millions of people here if that isn't turned around. But let's move on to something a little more.
If you want to lighten it up, we can stick with South Africa and do the white genocide stuff.
Let's talk taco trade first.
There we go.
That was pretty funny.
Let's talk taco.
Yeah,
insert a little clip of Trump getting mad about that.
Sure. This was I hadn't even heard about this until a reporter asked him about it at the White House. So it was coined by an FT writer, Robert Armstrong, and so taco.
It's Financial Times for those out of the loop,
right?
The lingo.
So taco refers to Trump always chickens out. And this is the theory that the guy laid out, which, Trump comes out of the gate storming with all these big tariffs. And then, shit goes sideways and he eventually backs down because he's very mercurial and he's very impulsive and he doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. And he also doesn't have the necessary political support to maintain, what would be a substantial hit to Americans' standard of living. And so he always,
And taco is a helpful acronym to the traders on Wall Street because knowing this, they could take advantage of that, right?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people have made money betting that the trade's going to be, that the tariffs are going to be reduced. And Trump said it was the nastiest question. Oh, he hates that.
Wall Street analysts have coined a new term called the taco trade. They're saying Trump always chickens out on your tariff threats, and that's why markets are higher this week. What's your response to that?
I kick out?
Chicken out.
Oh, then I chicken out. I've never heard that. You mean because I reduced China from 145% that I set down to 100 and then down to another number? Because I gave the European Union a 50% tax tariff. And they called up and they said, please, let's meet right now. We had a country people didn't think it was going to survive, and you ask a nasty question like that.
He can't even remember what he's done in the last week.
He's like, it's part of his 12-dimensional chess strategy.
Yeah, don't ever say what you said Trump, calling it the nastiest question. And if there's one thing about Trump, he definitely is a chicken, like any bully. He doesn't stand up to people who could actually, injure him. But he's also incredibly petty and thin-skinned. So this question might cause a global depression.
It's true. One never knows what'll trigger him to do the most insane thing.
Yeah. Or,
Now,
I
luckily-
mean, well, I guess you were going to bring up just now that I thought it might cause global depression, but Trump just got shot down in the courts big time on all of his tariffs.
That is indeed what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Lucky for us. Someone's doing something.
Yeah, so David Dan has a good piece on this. So the U.S. Court of International Trade unanimously ruled, 3-judge panel, including a Trump appointee, saying that presidents do have pretty sweeping powers to impose tariffs, but there are certain
Given
rules.
by because Congress has given them.
Yeah.
Not inherently.
No, not inherently. No, according to laws that Congress has passed, that you can, they've delegated the authority over the years. But there's still certain procedures that you have to follow. For instance, there's 6 statutes that you could invoke. David writes, quote, 3 of them require specific findings by executive branch agencies that countries are either threatening national security, violating normal trade agreements with their conduct, or injuring a critical domestic industry. 2 do not require formal findings, but the tariff rates that can be imposed are limited to no more than 15% in one case and 50% in another. So Trump didn't want any of those. And he turned to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. Here, any national emergency presenting an unusual and extraordinary threat allows the president to regulate importation. The issue with this is that, David writes, quote, while the law has been used for sanctions on foreign countries, no president before Trump had ever used it for tariffs. The statute never even uses the term. So this is just like clearly a misapplication of the law, and Trump likely could have gotten much of what he wanted to do by using the other, laws that exist. I mean, He probably couldn't have gone up to 145%.
Well, that's the thing. That's probably why he didn't do it, because they would cap how much he could, how high the tariffs could be. I think it was like 15% for one and 50% for another, something like that. Yeah,
exactly. But, like 50% is a really fucking big tariff it's functionally quite similar to 145%. I think the difference here is, Trump doesn't know anything about tariffs. He doesn't understand sort of the implications of what they would do. And that's why he would go for such a ridiculously huge number as 145%. And B, he doesn't.
Beautiful number. The big, beautiful number,
Exactly. And he doesn't want to jump through any of the hoops, He doesn't give a shit about
that's the other thing. It limited the number of days. There was he'd have to adhere to the actual congressional limits.
Yeah. He doesn't want to do that. He wants to dial them up and down based on, whatever he's been watching on Mar-a-Lago, TBS night court reruns. And, that's just offensive to him to think that he has to play by any type of rules. And yeah, so that he'll undoubtedly appeal this to the Supreme Court, but I would question whether the court would go for this one. I think that they're perfectly fine. They recently ruled that Trump's firing of the NLRB and FTC commissioners was fine because those agencies are young, but you can't fire Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve because that agency is old.
Now, and to do that, they had to rewrite, precedent. They had to really change the nature of constitutional law. So, and that was just, per their prerogative, but it wasn't just to make Trump happy. That's something that they have vested, the reactionaries in the court have a vested interest in doing.
Yeah, it's just a facially preposterous ruling that the Congress is forbidden, from prohibiting the president from firing, people, but that you can still have that protection for this Federal Reserve, even though it was set up after the first administrative independent agency, which I believe is the Interstate Commerce Commission, set up in 1887. And they're like, well, we had the Bank of the United States back in the early 1800s. We're like, it's just ridiculous. The reason is that they don't want Trump to replace Jerome Powell with Mr. Beast or whatever the fuck and just fuck the economy up because they have a lot of investments and they have a lot of billionaire, people that are telling them what their opinion should be. And so they, said, nope, Jerome Powell's safe, but you can get rid of all of the labor law people because we don't give a fuck about that. Destroy that part of the, regulatory state.
But this goes back to the court putting a limit on what FDR could do and Humphrey's executor. So this is like a long-standing thing that they've changed in terms of like firings and so the court still is a dangerous court, but they have sometimes their own vested interest counter Trump sometimes.
Cases. And this goes to return to the question of tariffs. I mean, who knows what they would do, but I would be surprised if you could get 5 votes for Trump can just do this completely deranged trade war on every country at once. It's very clearly illegal the way he's doing it. So. It's illegal, and I don't think that the big money donors in American politics want that.
In fact, the lawsuits have been brought by these libertarian groups.
Yeah. And, you look at the Wall Street Journal editorial page. I mean, that's just the voice of capital.
Wasn't one of the groups like a Koch-funded thing with Scalia's name on it?
Yeah, it was. And I think that this, the tariff policy, it's just a constituency of one. All the MAGA, chuds follow Trump around like a lost sheep. But, that's just because it's Trump. If he were to change his mind on tariffs or he were, forbidden from doing it, I don't think anybody wants this really because it doesn't make any sense. It's crazy. And so I would guess, I could be wrong, but I would guess that the court will say, no, we agree with the lower court. You can't do it like that. And so it'll be a much less chaotic and ridiculous process going forward.
Yeah. Though, I'd be curious post-Trump, once he thankfully, passes away, whether the Steve Bannon types, if people will still feel fired up by the Steve Bannons of the world who have some small purchase in the kind of reactionary media echo chamber, or if the Steve Bannons themselves only have the juice because Trump's still around.
Yeah, good question. I think you'll see a lot of people, fighting like cats in a sack to, claim the mantle.
Right? It's like when the emperor goes down.
Yeah. I don't think any of them have Trump's juice, particularly not Trump's juice circa 2015, 2016, when he got such a hammerlock on everyone. And above all, none of them are a A-list celebrity in the way that Trump was a number of years.
They weren't on TV on a popular show for many years looking like a badass who's got all the good decision-making skills in the world. You're fired.
Yeah. Yeah. That is really, really difficult to create. And it kind of doesn't even exist anymore. We don't have movie stars like we used to, except for the ones that are all, 50 plus, like Tom Cruise. The Hollywood has kind of, eviscerated its ability to create celebrities like that. And the media landscape is so much more fragmented than it was back in the day. So maybe it'll be Mr. Beast. I don't know. Claiming the mantle of the MAGA movement. I think it would certainly be a big fight, though. And I am not clear at all. J.D. Vance is very unpopular, viscerally repellent. Joe Rogan, he's apparently quite unpopular, his favorables versus his unfavorables.
Oh, that's interesting.
But yeah, well,
we shall see to be continued. In the meantime, we have to deal with things like white genocide. Look at that transition.
Yeah.
You wrote a great piece. People should read it because it's very funny, a very, very good satirical piece about a true story, which is your time in South Africa with the Peace Corps. But you used your life story to address the pervasive problem that the Trump administration is pointing out in South Africa. In fact, it's so problematic, they did a press conference with the South African president about it. So I don't know if everyone has already heard about this, but you want to fill people in?
Yeah, poor old Cyril Ramaphosa there, who just had to go into the lion's den and try to basically beg and scrape for favors from the Mad King Trump. And Trump put up this video, which is like a Facebook montage of right-wing propaganda saying there's white genocide in South Africa. The farmers are being killed. Death, 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 said Trump. And yeah, it was, I was there.
This is a real eating their cats and dogs moment, right? Eating the cats and dogs.
Yeah, they're eating the cats. And I was there. It's been a while. I was there in South Africa from 2009 to 2011, 2 years service in the Peace Corps. And, Yeah, I lived way out in the boonies, in the former homeland of Bophuthatswana, like 100 kilometers from the nearest town. And I lived with a black host family in a village where I was the only white person. And it's funny, I would meet white South Africans on occasion. And the way that I got around the country, because I didn't have a car, you couldn't possibly afford a car. You rent one occasionally. But for the most part, I would take public transit. I would take the bus, and I would hitchhike because the bus didn't, like, if I wanted to go to Pretoria, that would mean if I wanted to take the usual bus, I'd have to go south to Kuruman. That takes like 2 hours, and then you get a bus. And so you go way out of your way, much faster to just hitchhike to Freiburg and then catch a public taxi or a bus from there. And so, I was just all the time wandering around, going on runs by myself or walking around to the dried up riverbed there by myself, the only white face and for, dozens of kilometers, only white person on the bus, only white person on the taxi. An instructive experience, by the way. I think I highly recommend that to people. You get a sense for, being the subject of everyone's attention. One funny thing was there's another volunteer who lived about 50 kilometers up the road, and he was like 6'4" and had hair like down to his shoulders, and people would confuse us all the time. It's like, oh, it's Teboho. No, it's Tabo. And you can tell because of the 8-inch height difference. But it makes sense. You think it's like, oh, that's the white dude. They're all the same,
yeah,
right? How do you tell them apart? You don't need to. But at any rate, you talk to these white South Africans, and they would just be terrified at the idea of, taking public transportation, walking around by yourself out in the village, and it was a cousin to this paranoia. Even the white South Africans never said there's anything like white genocide happening. That's just preposterous. It's not. There's nothing like that going on. But they were scared. But the reality was I was fine. Being a man was a little bit different. I don't think I would do that if I was a woman, not by myself. But, one time I was walking back from the shoe store and somebody ran off with my shoes. I bought a new pair of boots and it was like out $100, which sucked. But that was my only experience with, successful robbery. And for overwhelmingly, like 99.9% of the time, people were completely normal. They were just, it was like, oh, what are you doing here? But
it's again classic reactionary jujitsu grievance politics, where we take a place that has a history of actual racism and apartheid, also retaliating against a place that was bringing the suit against Israel for their apartheid and for their ethnic cleansing and genocide. And the Trump administration is attacking them, I think, for a number of reasons, not the least of which is they're able to really curry favor with white MAGA supporters who are all about the fact that the real harm, the real injustice is when people accuse white people of racism and teach it in the schools. And really, and this is true, the refugees that Trump supports bringing into this country rather than deporting are white South Africans. So this is also part of the story, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he brought in 49 of them or 53 or something. And I think that's exactly it. The real grievance here, I think if you dig down to it, whether it's conscious or not, was that the apartheid ended. In the mid 20th century, the conservative movement was all in on defending apartheid. That became sort of untenable by the 80s, but Reagan more or less had to be dragged kicking and screaming into supporting the BDS movement against South African apartheid. And it was a sort of a piece with the general Cold War anti-communism. South Africa was viewed as a bulwark against Marxist revolutionaries in Angola and whatnot. But I think it was also just in keeping with the conservative movement's defense of Jim Crow. This was William F. Buckley's big thing in the 50s. And then they eventually lost on that one too. But, a consistent defense of racism and racial caste systems in the United States and elsewhere. And that's rooted in slavery and the Confederacy, I think. That's the core, the founding root of American conservatism. And it's just like cashing out and portraying white South Africans who to this day are the, richest group of people on average in the country and still own like 80% of the farmland as being, subject to genocide. It's the, the idea, just the hysterical exaggeration of the harm of racism being reduced in any way. They can't stand it. They want it to be more racist everywhere.
And you mentioned McCarthyism. It's not for no reason that once again we have a kind of McCarthyist attack on Palestinian protesters, people protesting the Israeli genocide that the U.S. is funding and arming, and that South Africa is trying to stop as well. There's a link between Red Scare McCarthyist tactics and these reactionary moves you're talking about historically that are happening right now with the Trump administration. Yeah,
I mean, it just makes it so disgusting because you look around and like there is a genocide happening. Ehud Olmert, right? The former Israeli prime minister, the guy who ran Operation Cast Lead. I mean, I think he stopped short of calling it a genocide, but he said it was war crimes, that we are, butchering innocent civilians, that, this is a war of extermination. And you take a people and you bomb the shit out of them and you force them to move to places and then bomb that place and you starve them out. You prevent food and water from getting into the country. That's genocide.
And you destroy 36 out of the 37 hospitals. You destroy all their universities. It's genocide and ethnic cleansing and war crimes, all the things. And the intent is publicized on all the social media and in press conferences and in interviews, from high up down to the ground troops. It's just it's never been more clear, never been more accessible on your phones and in the media. It's just it's everywhere.
Yeah,
right.
Basically live streamed, sometimes by Israeli soldiers. And this, maybe we could mention briefly that the European Union seems to be getting more and more irritated with Israel about this. Even Germany, which is crazy because Germany has been a huge supporter of Israel, maybe even more so than the U.S., apart from the amount of money and arms we've been sending. But in a case of like obvious, I don't know how you want to put it, but like guilt for their role in the Holocaust of the Jews, right? There is a kind of a reluctance in any way to not defend Israel at all times and at all costs. And even now, Germany now is starting to say, wait a minute, okay, this is not a good look when you're massacring children all the time in a way that's really obvious. Yeah, Chancellor Friedrich Merz said he, quote, no longer understands Israel's objectives. Quote, the way in which the civilian population has been affected can no longer be justified by a fight against Hamas terrorism. Pretty weak statement.
Weak sauce.
But it's a fairly significant shift in rhetoric. And, I think it's one of those areas where the instinct is to just let them get away with it. If you could just like put a lid on this and get it out of the headlines. But Israel doesn't want to do that, and it's not going to do that. I think they're playing for all the marbles. They just announced a new massive expansion of settlements in the West Bank. I think full ethnic cleansing is the goal here of Gaza and the West Bank. They want to clear everyone out, annex the whole thing, and have it just be a Jews-only state from the river to the sea.
And to be fair, many people have been predicting this since October 7th happened as the campaign started, the evidence rolled in, the whole time for years, people be like, okay, this is what's happening. No, this is what, don't you see this is what's happening? And now finally you have some people are like, oh yeah, I guess that's what's happening. And the book that's that should be mentioned for many reasons, but the title is so apt, is one day everyone will have been against this.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think it's one day everyone will have always been against this, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the way.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the opinion polls where there was like, do you support invading Iraq in like February 2002, and it was like 71% support, and then 10 years later they asked, did you support invading Iraq, and it's like 70% said no. People are good at tricking themselves in that way. But yeah, I mean, I guess it's encouraging to see, on the one hand, Europe getting progressively more frustrated, even if it's pretty ineffectual at this point. And on the other hand, I am sort of encouraged in this narrow circumstance by how easy it is to bribe Trump. Because the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia are not particularly happy about this. It's bad for them domestically, and they're not.
And they're pieces of shit too, and they've been
horrible.
terrible, right? Yeah, and they haven't cared about Palestinian lives either. But at least they're in this instance trying to motivate a change that benefits them as well, right?
Yeah, it's just bad for like domestic unrest and things like that, and they want to see like a more stable future that isn't just let's kick out / murder all the Palestinians.
Plus, whichever ones aren't murdered, they don't want to have to absorb the populations that are being ethnically cleansed out of the area.
Yeah, and so Qatar, Saudi Arabia, if they really wanted to make a difference here, they could just go, up to Trump with the big old.
They already gave Qatar already gave Trump this multi-billion-dollar plane, right?
Yeah. No, exactly. So,
which is, by the way, did you catch that in the South African president's conference with Trump? Yeah. He's like, well, I can't afford. You want a plane? You want me to give you a plane? and Trump, of course, quips back, I'd take a plane.
This is a level of corruption, or you're just right there in front of all the reporters being like, I'm sorry, I just don't have a big, $1 billion bribe. But yeah, Qatar or Saudi Arabia could definitely afford that. And so,
I mean, now apparently there's who knows, but a deal in the works with Hamas at the table, and the Trump's negotiator has been pushing that might have hostage swap, temporary ceasefire for 60 or 70 days, but with certain conditions that say that Israel will actually not just go right back to genociding everyone, as long as negotiations continue. And so there's like an attempt for the temporary ceasefire to lead to a more permanent ceasefire. Anyway, whatever progress can be made is good, obviously. But yeah, I'm not holding my breath.
No. And by the same token, you have like quite a relatively similar situation happening in Ukraine. Because one reason not to be a little skeptical about what Israel is doing in terms of negotiations is that they just did that, and then they more or less immediately violated the agreement and started the war back up again. And that's exactly what Putin has done for over and over again since 2014. You have these kind of quote unquote negotiations going on towards maybe getting a ceasefire in Ukraine. The Russian demands are for, as last I saw, is like all 4 of the provinces in eastern Ukraine that Russia has quote unquote annexed, even though they don't actually possess a big chunk of those. And the Ukrainians, I believe, at this point still have a little piece of Russian territory near Kursk. And the war is not by any stretch of the imagination won by Russia. They've been with a big offensive. They've made some progress, but they've been taking just stupendous casualties. I've seen estimates in the 800,000 range, 800 to 900,000. This was some months ago.
Terrible.
The Russian economy is in the shitter, and when whole big chunks of it have been re-geared around reactivating all of these old Soviet era, pieces of equipment, tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, guns, and so forth. And those are starting to run low in certain categories. And so you're looking at an economy which is going to have to be totally re-geared again towards something else when the war ends. And so
that's the thing. War doesn't just kill and maim people, which it does, and traumatize people. It also has effects on the economy and hunger and inflation and oil prices. And I mean, don't forget, we're in a global world where things are interconnected. And I was reading today about hunger globally, and the fact that there is a number of people who are hungry is greater now than it was last year, even though the amount of food produced this year was greater than that produced last year, that there's enough food to feed the total world population plus 3 billion more people, right? If it was actually distributed in a way that made sense. But actually now we have 733 million people that have chronic hunger in 2023. And that's 2023, right? Even though there's like 11 billion metric tons of food that the world's farmers and agribusiness produced. And so, you look at the global system and you wonder, well, why is it the case that we have all this food and then so many people starving? And part of the reason are the wars, and the wars that create the famines. And the other reason is capitalism and waste.
Yeah, there's people who are too poor to, afford the food, and then there's places where they're just being deliberately starved. And that can interact with each other. Actually, there was a big report from ProPublica today about some various refugee camps in parts of Africa that have been cut off from USAID food aid. And the result is a big increase in violence, conflicts, sex trafficking, and so on and so forth. As like this, it's like when people, then there's not enough food to go around. That's just naturally what tends to happen. And it's something could be, reversed overnight, but probably won't be. And
well,
so
it's like Harvard.
Yeah, sure. Everyone's favorite university. I think the most amusing part of this story is that this is the one thing that seems to reliably get Barack Obama to leave his fortress of solitude and actually start making public statements and like motivating people and going to like try to bolster their confidence. It's like you have the last little bit of a presidential election, then he'll come out and he'll give some speeches. But yeah, come after Harvard. It's his alma mater, man. You can't be doing that.
Harvard Law should play like a quote from Good Will Hunting. Let's go fuck up some smart kids. So wait, you didn't tell people the actual story. What's the story?
Yeah, so Trump has, I think he threatened to free or attempted to freeze like all federal funding to Harvard University, which is I think on the order of like $9 billion a year. And he is also attempted to prohibit them from taking any international students, which is a large proportion of their student body. And this has come under immediate, lawsuits. And in fact, so just today, Thursday, a judge has blocked the Trump administration's their international student thing. It's a temporary restraining order, basically arguing, like Trump officials have said in public that they're punishing Harvard for political reasons, that like we won't get people who don't get colleges and universities that sort of fall in line. And like, that's just like a flagrant, open, on television violation of the First Amendment. And
right. Which he does against institutions. He does against the media. He does against individual students and people who speak out in ways he doesn't like. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, you come back to where will the Supreme Court land on this? I believe a whole bunch of them went to Harvard Law, if I'm not mistaken, or Yale. It's like
Harvard and Yale are the most prominent, and then you got Notre Dame for Barrett and
wow, what a scrub.
Yeah, that's diversity for you,
on the grants question, I think something I didn't even really understand myself until I started reading some reporting on this is that, obviously Harvard is a big, incestuous elite, conspiracy of like privilege, perpetuating privilege and so on. But it's also just like a keystone part of the entire economy of Boston, greater Boston, and particularly the medical system. I saw some reporting in the Harvard Crimson that of those cuts to Harvard, something like $6 billion of that would fall on hospitals, because
Sure.
a lot of this stuff is sort of a pass through. They have a relationship with the Harvard Medical School and, doing like various scientific research and stuff. This is just how the government funds.
It's just like in Philadelphia with Penn, University of Pennsylvania, massive hospital system run, connected through the university, right?
Exactly.
Penn hospitals. That's why education and healthcare are the two major industries in Philadelphia. I think it's that way in a lot of major towns and cities that have big universities.
Yeah, this is a classic model of economic development around the country, not just in Boston, but everywhere. There's all sorts of, smaller scale versions of this. Hell, here in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, there's two schools, Wilkes University and King's College, and that's just like a foundation of the economy. Like it would probably be half the population if those didn't exist. It provides.
What's doing so well in this country that we should attack? Education and healthcare.
Yeah.
Those seem like two things we don't need and that are doing too well. We need to really undermine those systems.
Yeah. And so you have these, the massive research complexes in cities like Boston and Philadelphia. And then you have a whole bunch of little, liberal arts schools that are propping up the economies of small towns all across like Appalachia and the Midwest. And just tear the guts out of them if you were to apply this.
Speaking of dystopia, here's a quote that I was reading from a Slate article. Starting in 2026, Pennsylvania will require kindergartners to, quote, identify entrepreneurial character traits of historical and contemporary entrepreneurs, unquote, and middle schoolers to, quote, identify ways to market yourself as a job candidate. This is good news, folks. This is good news.
I don't like what it's crazy. Like from, traveling around in the Nordics, I remember reading a story the other day about in I believe it was Finland, they had like a faux sort of entrepreneurial conference. It was like a simulation basically, where you gave the kids from a whole bunch of schools, you gave them a bunch of like fake money, and then then they would set up like different businesses, and they would learn about the principles of accounting and sort of advertising, right, and the ins and outs of all that stuff, and that like it seemed perfectly fine. It was like, oh, I'm just like people want to get into business, or they're curious about labor relations. They had to have a pretend union. That was part of it was like employer negotiations and stuff like that. But I mean, it was just very practical. And I think the crazy thing about this, American schools are not even actually that interested in teaching about the ins and outs of business, which are often boring as shit, but more like the cult of it. Like, we're trying to valorize business. We're going to teach kindergartners about being an entrepreneur. Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
It's removing all of the elements of like developing the human being's capacities as a person. Yeah. And instead skipping right ahead to the instrumentalization of a person for the ends of business.
Yeah.
Not realizing, of course, that even if you want people to be good workers, they should develop their capacities. Like, first of all, don't forget, like, you actually, to have a worker that's competent, you need someone with critical thinking and communication skills and all those things. So, but like, even to instrumentalize, you should focus on developing someone. But they just are so clearly removing the true nature of education, which is education for education's sake, and education for the sake of like truth and beauty and learning more about yourself and the world you live in. And just there are spiritual ends, there are emotional ends, intellectual ends, all these various ends. None of that matters. All that matters is when you're unemployed and starving, we can say, you know what, you got a C in second grade self-marketing. You know what I mean? And that's why I'm going to pin responsibility morally and otherwise on you for not understanding the need to be able to be entrepreneurial from middle school on or whatever, right? Like it's a gross, and this is what they've done with like human capital and like when we've had Marshall Steinbaum on, all the student debt stuff, the logic of that, is you got to like take out debt to invest in yourself. And it's all on you to determine your own success, right? Which is just a bullshit cover-up story for the exploitation of workers and students.
Yeah, they're just undermining the whole point of education, the deep down purpose of it since, going back thousands of years, that this is about, the discovery and process and instruction of knowledge and like the deep questions and truths.
Social developments, right?
Yeah.
And understanding how to be a friend or a parent or how to serve your country, the democratic function of public education, the public good of understanding justice and injustice and policy and issues, and like what you're obligated in ethics, what's obligating you to other people, and how you should do that well, like all these important questions.
Yeah, and it's just, we've seen this, I guess now from kindergarten up through universities, is that like, no, the purpose of an education is just to turn you into a sort of economic unit, that you are in fact a piece of machinery that's designed to make money in the market. And
that's right.
None of that other bullshit matters at all. We don't care about it.
Yeah.
Only thing that matters is the market and entrepreneurs and working and
fundamentally, this is why the left has to have an alternate positive vision. It has to have a critique that says our system of capitalism, imperialism is evil for a number of reasons, not the least of which is it destroys our relationships with each other, our relationships with truth, our understanding of the meaning and purpose and source of happiness in life. And it doesn't just destroy our ability to survive and make things precarious. It also takes away the ability for the higher order pleasures and meaning of life. And the alternate vision should say, like, everything is economic and political and spiritual. And fundamentally, whether you're talking about the education system or the workplace, like the vision needs to be about how do we come together to flourish in all these different ways? How do we come together to understand each other better, to collaborate better, to create things better? This is something that's always political and always about educating ourselves and always about caring for each other, rather than a system that's instrumental to the ends of those who would use others for their own satisfaction. And it's always going to be a virtue and vice thing, right? Like the left has to reclaim virtue because virtue is about excellence and happiness and flourishing. And that requires understanding relationships and systems and how we affect each other, right? And these principles that sound just like, belief systems or whatever, they're actually like fundamental truths that no one's free until everyone's free, that the genocide over there actually affects me over here. And the two visions can be more stark, but the left has to lay out the alternate positive vision that also educates us as to the source of the problems and the nature of the solutions.
And I think that, this maybe explains why universities have been so hesitant to stand up to Trump. You saw Columbia just like turning itself inside out, trying to appease him. And I think it's because a lot of these administrators, trustees and whatnot, they have completely internalized the neoliberal version of the university. They don't see themselves as preserving any sort of like grand tradition stretching back to, the ancient city-states and Library of Alexandria and shit. It's just like, no, we're producing obedient workers for the next generation of capitalists. And this, by the same token, you don't see like science necessarily defended in the way as being a public good to create like the next generation of cancer treatments that would be available to all more often, or at least in terms of, public discussion. It's like, well, we're going to make new patents for businesses and this is going to make big pharma shitloads of money, even though, a lot of these things do end up being, sort of publicly available. Certainly a lot of them are funded with public money. But yeah, there's, this crusading vision of science, like, who's that? Jonas Salk, the guy who created the polio vaccine and then just gave the patent away, because that was the right thing to do. Like it was offensive to him to think that you would try to make money off of this thing. It should be available to everyone. And
but this reminds me, the evil villain of Musk, who the richest man in the world, who was like yelling at poor people and making more people poor, was called out by Bill Gates about this recently. But you know what, Bill Gates, you cared about your IP interests and your ideology so much too, that when the vaccines for COVID were going around, you had issues with giving away the intellectual property for that to make it easier for people around the world to be immunized. So you're part of the problem too, buddy.
Yeah. Yeah, he's not as bad as Elon, but he's pretty bad.
But there's a relationship between those two ideologies, is I think the point, right? Like the failures of economic liberalism and a focus on sustaining capitalist accumulation is part of why there's openings for the reactionaries to be as gross as they are, and that the left needs to counter both.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you'd say leaves it open, you cut out the legs of science and public good and public research by portraying it as just a machine for patents, so that, like investors basically can make shitloads of money, when it's much more noble. And I think it, in many ways, much more motivating to be like I remember the NIH scientist, the guy who designed the Moderna vaccine, and he got the news back that the test had come in positive, and he sat down and wept. His family.
Right.
He's like, this is a fulfillment of my entire life.
A true public servant, right?
Yeah, and it's like
not motivated by financial reward, but by the service that his contributions made.
Yeah, and it's like, it's not going to be patented by me. I'm never going to see a dime for this, but that's just fine.
And this is why we have to tell stories that valorize the right people and that villainize the right people. To put a cap on maybe the whole episode, there's a poll out about how abundance and the language around abundance, which we talked about, the Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson book, doesn't seem to poll as well. There's like 1,200 registered voters, and that language doesn't do as well as populist language that talks about the rich and how they're the source of the problems. And storytelling matters, and narratives matter. And so it turns out the even leftier version, right, that the one that's actually addressing needs even more and is more generous, the narrative around that is also more popular, right? So the popularizers should love that. Am I right?
Yeah, real funny. This was little background. Demand Progress. They commissioned a poll on this, and yeah, they did a couple of questions. So defined abundance as the big problem is bottlenecks that make it harder to produce housing, expand energy production, or build new roads and bridges. The populist argument is the big problem is that big corporations have way too much power over the economy and our government. 55.6% of all voters preferred the populist argument compared to 43.5% who like the abundance. 72.5% of Democrats, 55.4% for independents. I mean, this is not surprising at all. People like stark language that lays out, the actual conflicts, and not just like,
yep,
as important as they may be, like boring ass disputes about housing regulations. It's very ironic that a lot of the popularizer or popularist types like Ezra Klein have failed to appreciate this.
They always apply it to the left, but they don't apply it to their own side when the results don't go in their favor. So there's that.
Every one of these people is talking their book at all times. My policies that I support just happen to be the most popular ones, and everyone else needs to shut up. I mean, that's probably true of the left too, most of the time. But I think laying out a clear moral vision of what you want to achieve, who the villains are and who the heroes are, that's just much more appealing. It's like think about a television show or something. You don't want to watch a television show about housing regulations. You want to watch one about heroes and villains and grand conflict, because that's actually sort of what we're living in today.
And it's not true that they just want to affect how things are governed. They want to affect the narrative of the Democratic Party, it's because that's the narrative that will satisfy the consultant class and the donor class and make them less nervous. So yeah, that's part of what we're fighting.
Yeah. Yeah, and as we said in our episode on abundance, a lot of what they say that has a lot of truth to it. But that just means that when you're sort of writing up your actual detailed policy portfolio, you got to stick that stuff in there. You don't make it the centerpiece of your agenda. You need, big, strong, popular slogans that make sense, that get people's attention, and that they can remember. And abundance. Plainly, I mean, the data has spoken, so who are we to question it? But
I think that's a good place to end it, eh?
Yeah, good place to stop. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode.